Watch, you do not know when the master is coming. It could be at night and dawn or any time. What I say to you, I say to all. Now, all is every reader of the Mark's gospel from then till today. Okay. Consequently, we are left without the promise of a linear future in this age. The end could come at any time. All we have is the present and the guarantee of an eternal reward. The present is a time when we do God's will, often at great cost. And eternity is certain. The resurrection of the dead, life after death, will come to everyone in every age. Okay? And Mark's gospel seems to say, you can't expect greater security than this. I liken it to earthquake preparations in California. There's no reason the great earthquake could not happen in 10 minutes. We know that. And then you get out of the midterm. You have to be constantly ready because that's the nature of human life in general. So we always have to be prepared, but the guarantee of a final reward is certain, even if the future of our lives in this world, whether individually or communally, is always uncertain. Okay. Now, I'd like to spend the bulk of our time on Mark and miracles, but I want to start with a story to help you inspire some reflection. This is about my friend Bud. Bud was a journalism major, and when he graduated with his degree, he wasn't able to find a job in the United States. And he read an advertisement from the Christian University in Thailand asking for applications for a journalist position. He applied for the position and he got it. And when he arrived, it was understood he could teach in English. I guess when you're a journalist, you have to know English if you're going to do international news. In any case, he arrived and he was given supervision over the seminarians because the university, for the tiny Christian minority in Thailand, was also the seminary. This put Bud in an odd position because he wasn't actually a Christian. It never occurred to the Bud that when he was applying for the position that he was going to supervise seminarians, nor was it ever occurred to the university that a non-Christian would apply for the position. But he said, but I became a Christian. And I said, well, why? And he said, I was terribly impressed with how much the seminarians cared about each other. Now, another story that Bud told is this. One day, all over Bangkok, the capital of Thailand, posters went up which said, Christian miracle worker coming to town. If you are sick or need other healing, come and be healed. Bud was outraged, but he did go. And he said, well, he didn't see anyone being healed, but some people said that they had demons cast out. Apparently, folk culture in Thailand, at least at that time, was rather similar to folk culture in Galilee in Christ's day. But he asked a more profound question. Even if this person had been able to pull off all these miraculous healings, what would these Buddhists who knew nothing about Christianity think that Christianity was about? So I ask you to reflect as I go along on this question. What are the strengths and weaknesses of offering miracles in a religion particularly if you're offering miracles to try to convert people. Okay. All right, now on to Mark's Gospel, not Bud's adventures. Miracles are a major part of Mark's Gospel. I think the miracle stories take up something like a quarter of the entire text. And then miracles come up in all kinds of other places which you don't much notice them. Consider, for example, the taunting of Jesus on the cross. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now that we may see and believe. That's daring Jesus to work a miracle, and that's only one illustration. I see I have Kirsten Spalding to everyone, but wait, are you suggesting that Mark's miracles are trying to convert people? No. In Luke Acts, miracles convert people. In John, miracles are signs, minor pointers to something much more important, namely that Jesus is the incarnation of God. But Luke, Mark, and John address different social situations. And remember the social situation that Mark is addressing. False Christs, who are working signs and wonders, or at least claiming to, and saying, if you recognize me as the new Jesus, I will protect you from the suffering of this time. Okay. Now, like Christian tradition in general, Mark emphasizes that Jesus was a miracle worker, okay? And Jesus gives in Mark's gospel to his disciples the power to work miracles. We read in chapter 3 that Jesus chose the 12 so they might cast out demons. And then in chapter 6, he gives them power over demons, and they cast out demons and also anoint with olive oil many who are sick and heal them. Okay. Now, Mark also assumes that the miracles of Jesus are primarily acts of compassion. Now, in ancient magic, there are all kinds of curse miracles. The landlord evicts you, and you go to your neighborhood sorcerer and have him cast a horrible spell on the landlord so he slowly dies in agony, okay? The only curse miracle in Mark's gospel is the cursing of the fig tree. I don't know if the owner of the fig tree appreciated it, but at least that's an inanimate thing. But the fig tree is going to be your midterm exam. So we're going to have you explain the many dimensions of this very strange miracle, okay? What's far more important for us, though, is the miracles of Jesus, except for the fig tree, are always acts of compassion for those who are in great need, okay? It can be the sick. They may be physically sick, like Peter's mother-in-law, who was in bed with a fever. They may be the mentally sick, which is what we would call Mark's exorcisms. So, for example, in Mark chapter 5, we read some person who is so violent and disturbed, he can't live in the village anymore. He lives in the tombs, and he's always cutting himself up with rocks and screaming as he wanders on the hills and the mountains. We would diagnose that as severe mental illness. In chapter 9, we read about a poor boy who from time to time falls down, grinds his teeth, becomes rigid, and rolls around foaming at the mouth. The diagnosis of the father is that he has a demon. We would say probably that he has epilepsy, or at least that he is subject to some similar kind of seizure. But in any case, some of the miracles to help the physically and mentally ill. Two of the miracles are to feed the hungry, namely the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000. And then there are a couple miracles of people in danger, especially the stilling of the storm, when the disciples are in the boat and it's getting swamped, and Jesus is asleep, and they wake him up. And Jesus tells the storm to shut up, and it does. and then says to the disciples, why didn't you have any faith? Okay? Now, this last observation is a great solace to those of us who have to preach on the lectionary, because most of us are not very good at working miracles. So if we have miracles with healing the blind, the deaf, or whatever, then we can say, well, what you need to do is to help the blind and the deaf in the way that God has gifted you. Okay? So it challenges us readers who are not miracle workers to offer help in more conventional, less spectacular ways. Okay? Nevertheless, Mark's presentation, even if you believe in the wildest of miracles, is unsettling in two respects to the Christian reader, maybe to any reader. The first is that Jesus, whom Mark says is the Christ, God's Son, sometimes has difficulty working miracles. Okay? Now we can start with a very odd passage in Mark's Gospel. I'm going to read today from the New Revised Standard Version rather than my own translations. Translations are always an interpretation, and I don't want to skew it. So I'll read someone else's interpretation, but you will see a problem. Okay? So in Mark chapter 6, verse 5, we read about this. Jesus has come home to Nazareth. People aren't all that excited because he's only a local boy. And then Jesus says, verse 4, prophets are not without honor except in their hometown and among their own kin and in their own house. And he could do no deeds of power there, except he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them, and he was amazed at their unbelief. This is an extraordinarily difficult passage because Mark says Jesus couldn't work miracles, and he did. He couldn't work miracles, but he healed sick people. And he was amazed at their lack of faith, or at their unbelief. This suggests that Mark took an earlier story in which Jesus historically went to his hometown, got a cool reception, and only worked a few miracles. It's Mark who says he couldn't work miracles, or added that, because obviously he could and even did. Okay? So this is a theme that Mark is emphasizing, even adding to the narrative. The most extreme example of Jesus having trouble working miracles is in chapter 9 with the epileptic boy I just described who falls down and rolls around foaming at the mouth. The disciples are not able to cure the kid. So then the father approaches Jesus and asks, if you can do anything, help us. And Jesus protests, if you can, all things are possible to those who believe. Then we have a very famous statement. The father says, I believe, help my unbelief. Now that's not the kind of missionary thing that we often take it to be. It's showing that the father has the least possible faith while having any at all. I believe, help my unbelief. And now the miracle is extraordinarily difficult. When Jesus lays his hands on the boy goes into what we would call convulsions, falls down, and the bystanders said, he's dead. But in fact, at that point, Jesus grasps his arm and picks him up, and he's able to stand. Okay? Now that's a rather embarrassing miracle. Okay? Now, I think historically, it's undoubtedly true that sometimes Jesus did have difficulty working miracles, because I don't see how Mark could have invented something that embarrassing to Christianity, especially since his readers are mostly Christians. He writes for Christians because he doesn't have to explain a lot of things. He assumes we know, for example, who Peter, Andrew, James, and John really are. Okay? But what is significant is that Mark chose to include this embarrassing fact that Jesus sometimes had difficulty working miracles. Matthew and Luke, even though they use Mark, leave out all the embarrassing material. So, for example, with the epileptic boy, in Matthew, Jesus simply heals the boy, and that's it. There's nothing about the boy falling down and being declared dead by the bystanders. A second problem is that sometimes Jesus insists that a miracle be kept quiet, and sometimes that it come to public attention. Let's look at a miracle story in which Jesus insists in the strongest terms that the miracle be kept silent. Okay? This is a healing of the deaf and dumb man in chapter 7, beginning around verse 31, and my pages are sticking together. But anyway, there you are. Okay. Now, they brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. Now notice how much Mark emphasizes Christ's attempt to keep the miracle secret. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed, this is a difficult miracle, and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one. But the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, he has done everything well, he even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. Okay. Here, Jesus works the miracle in private, away from the crowd. He tells them to tell no one, and yet it fails utterly. Okay. On other occasions, Jesus works a miracle in private and then insists that it be publicized. So a good illustration of this is the crazy man in the beginning of chapter 5 of Mark. Remember him? He lives among the tombs. He's always cutting himself up with rocks, and he's shrieking all day. Okay? Jesus is with his disciples and the insane man alone. They're either in the tombs or on the mountains. No one else is there. But as he tries to cast out the demons beg for mercy. They don't want to be thrown out of their native region, and they ask if they can run into some pigs. So Jesus says, fine. But the problem with that is that this makes the miracle a public matter. The pigs go bonkers. They throw themselves off a cliff. And the herders rush off the village to say what has happened, and everyone comes to see. Then they ask Jesus to get out of town because he destroyed property. And the healed man asks to be with Jesus. Jesus does not give him permission, but tells him to broadcast the miracle. Go and tell everyone, your family and friends, what has happened. So here's an illustration of a miracle that no one would have known about except the crazy man and the disciples. But Jesus chooses to make it a public matter by the pig suicide, but also by sending the man out to tell his families and friends how much God has done for him. Okay? Now we come to a remarkable thing about when Jesus tries to shut up a miracle or tries to publicize a miracle. On the occasions when Jesus tries to silence a miracle, word of the miracle dramatically spreads. I just gave you an illustration of that. Same in chapter 1, verses 40 to 45, to which we will return. On the other hand, when Jesus brings a miracle to public attention, sometimes there is no public reaction. So, for example, in the woman with the hemorrhage, there's a miracle that no one would have known about. She had bleeding. She touched Jesus from behind. Jesus asked, "Who touched me?" And his disciples say, "You're out of your mind. The crowd is practically crushing us." But he looks around to see who's doing it. Then he forces the woman to come forward, even though she's trembling and shaking, and makes her declare the whole truth with the crowd being there. And then he says, "Your faith has saved you." So there's another miracle that no one would have known about, and the woman would never have talked about because it was embarrassing. Someone with bleeding in those days was thought to be ritually unclean. Okay? Or there's a negative reaction. Remember about our friends the pigs? After Jesus had destroyed so much property, the villagers asked him to leave. Okay? Now, as my own teacher, William Countryman, has shown, in Mark's gospel, Christ's power to work miracles decreases. And this explains an otherwise puzzling section in Mark's gospel, the summary of the two feedings. Okay? So I'll read from chapter 8, verses 14 to 21. And please note as I do this, how much pressure Mark puts on the reader to figure out what's going on. Okay? Now the disciples had forgotten to bring any bread, and they had only one loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, "Watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod." And they said to one another, "It is because we have no bread." And becoming aware of it, Jesus said to them, "Why are you talking about having no bread?" Now think about this as the reader. Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? And do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? They said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? And they said to him, 7. Then he said to them, "Do you not yet understand?" That really puts pressure on the reader. We better understand, which was embarrassing to scholars because people didn't understand. But Countryman said, no, there's nothing hard to understand about this. This is underlining the miracles are decreasing. In the first miracle, Jesus fed more people, starting with less bread and fish, and more was left over. The second miracle was in every way inferior. In the second miracle, Jesus started with more bread and fish, fed fewer people, and less was left over. There are other indications, incidentally, of the decrease. For example, in Mark's gospel, the 5,000 were all men, which embarrassed Matthew. He thought, is this a stag party? So he said, not counting the women and the children, when Matthew was editing Mark. Whereas the 4,000, Mark does not say they were all men. Okay, at least in that culture, they believe that men ate more than women, which is true of me, unfortunately. All right, now, if you look at the surrounding miracles, you see the pattern of decrease very clearly. Remember chapter 7 with the epileptic boy? Jesus sighs or groans, depending how you translate snazo. The next miracle, after the feedings, is the 2-stage healing of the blind man. Jesus lays his hands on the man, but the first time the man only gets partial sight. He can't distinguish people and trees. Only on try number 2 do we have full sight. But at least the first try gives improvement. Okay, at least some sight occurs. Whereas with the epileptic boy in chapter 9, the first try makes things dramatically worse. The boy goes into convulsions and appears to be dead. And then when Jesus tries the second time, it's not all that dramatic. He pulls him up, and Mark says the boy was able to stand. That's rather limited. Okay? Now, this decrease in Christ's ability to work miracles is, of course, due to the decreasing faith of the disciples and those who request the miracles. We saw that already. Mark opens that theme with Nazareth. He couldn't work many miracles there. Actually, he did work miracles. He healed some people, but he couldn't. And he marveled at their unbelief. Okay? This is very striking when you get to the feeding of the 4,000. The reader is sympathetic when the disciples don't know what to do when Jesus says to feed the 5,000. But after he pulled that one off, and then Jesus says to the disciples again, we got to feed these people, they come up with a dense statement, how could anyone feed this mob in the wilderness? Now that's pretty stupid after the feeding of the 5,000. Then after the feeding of the 4,000, the disciples are, in the passage we read shortly a while ago, worried that they have only one loaf of bread with them in the boat. So the miracles are decreasing because faith is decreasing. Please remember that the father of the epileptic boy had the least possible faith while having any at all. This is very important. In Mark, faith can work miracles, but miracles do not produce faith. Okay? Maybe that's worth repeating. In Mark, faith works miracles, but miracles do not produce faith. In Luke, Acts, it's very different. Miracles convert people to Christianity. Okay? Now, it's particularly striking when you get to, after the feeding of the 5,000, that the Pharisees come and demand that Jesus show them a sign from heaven. Jesus becomes irate. No sign will given to this evil generation, and stomps away. And after all these miracles, the Pharisees shouldn't need another one. But Jesus refuses to work a miracle to give them faith. Okay? Now, we now come to something that, as far as I know, only I have argued. And since no one bothered to take my book seriously, no one knows this except for you. All right, so here we are. I believe that if you do a careful study of the miracle stories, it shows this. Jesus will hush up miracles if there is no faith, or the miracle will lead to public acclaim. Okay. But he will publicize secret miracles if they lead to him being rejected, or they bear witness to someone who already has faith. Okay? Now let's start this by talking about the miracle stories in chapter 5, verses 21 through 54. It's a long passage, and I apologize for reading it, but I want you to ask this question. Mark has inserted one miracle in the middle of another. Mark likes to do one story inside another because he wants you to compare them. So in the two stories, the raising of Jairus' daughter and the healing of the woman who had hemorrhaging, I want you to ask the questions. Is the miracle public or private? Does Jesus try to hush up the miracle or publicize it? Does Jesus' effort to keep the miracle from being publicized? Is it likely to work? And is there faith or lack of faith? So let's compare these two miracles, okay? All right, so chapter 5, verse 21 and following. When Jesus had crossed again into the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come, lay your hand on her so that she may be well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had come forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And the disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the ruler's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble this teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he'd entered in, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. Okay, Mark has put one miracle story inside another miracle story. Now, in the miracle of the bleeding woman, was that initially known to everyone, or was it a secret miracle?
Secret.
Did Jesus insist on publicizing it? Was there a crowd present?
Yes.
Did she then force the woman to make a public confession?
Well, he looks around for her. Does he make her say it out loud, or does he speak quietly to her in the midst of the crowd? We don't really know.
We don't really know, but the crowd is certainly there. And she comes forward in fear and trembling. So I think it's reasonable to say this is another illustration of Jesus making a private miracle public. Does the woman have faith or not?
Yes.
Yes.
If I touch even his clothes, I will be made well. But she shows her faith another way. She's afraid and trembling, but even so, she comes forward at Christ's command and tells the whole truth, and people are there. Okay. Now, in the healing of Jairus' daughter, in multiple points in the story, does Jesus try to get rid of everybody? The vast crowd is trying to follow him, but Jesus somehow tries to get rid of them. It's kind of strange. You wonder how did he manage to pull this one off? He let no one come with the Father except the father and mother and so forth. How did he do this? How did he throw everybody out of the funeral and all that stuff. But Mark stresses this tremendous effort to get rid of everybody. Then when he works the miracle, he demands that no one should know this. This reminds me of the CIA. What is the cover story for this? Try to imagine this. The whole village is at the funeral, and the next day, the child is going to be presented alive. How are they supposed to keep the miracle secret? That's quite a trick. But Mark isn't worried about realism. He's worried about his theology. So here Jesus works a miracle in private, which could not possibly be kept secret, but yet he orders it to be kept so. Okay? All right. So that's my thesis, right? So now let me deal with a story, which if I had anybody who ever read my stuff, they would offer as a counterexample, the most notable counterexample in the gospel they might well claim, which is with the raising of Jairus' daughter. Please note that did not produce faith. It only produced amazement. Okay. Now, if we go back to chapter 1, we read this. A leper came to him, begging him and kneeling, and he said to him, "If you choose, you can make me clean." Moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I do choose, be made clean." Immediately the leprosy left him and he was made clean. After sternly warning him, he sent him away at once, saying to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded as a testimony to them." But once again, this effort to keep the miracle silent is totally wrong. Doesn't work. But he went out and began to proclaim it freely and to spread the word so that Jesus could no longer go into town openly, but stayed out in the country, and people came to him from every quarter. Now, if I had any critics, they would say, well, here the man has faith. If you choose, you can make me clean. Is that a statement of faith?
If you choose, you can make me clean suggests more skepticism, I would say.
Or lack of belief in Christ's compassion. Note in the stilling of the storm, disciples say to Jesus, "Teacher, do not care that we are perishing." And Jesus rebukes them after stilling the storm for their lack of faith. What I think happened was Mark simply had this miracle story of the leper coming and getting healed, but Mark added, "if you choose." In any case, what is clear is that the man breaks faith with Jesus because Jesus orders him not to talk about the miracle, and he does talk about the miracle. So he does not have faith in that sense. So I don't think this is an exception. Okay. All right. That then brings the question of what is faith? I believe in Mark, faith is primarily that trust which allows you to persevere despite obstacles. Consider another miracle. Jesus is surrounded by a crowd, and there's a paralyzed man being carried on a mat. They can't get through the crowd, so they lug the man up on the roof and dig through the roof and lower the man through the hole. And we read Jesus seeing their faith. How do they see their faith? How do you see their faith?
Their perseverance.
Their perseverance. I mean, this is this is really going all out, lugging the man up on the roof, digging through. All right, that's faith. Okay. Faith is persevering despite obstacles. All right. I think the most important miracle in Mark's gospel is the healing of blind Bartimaeus in chapter 10. As we saw earlier in the previous class, it occupies an important literary position. This is the first time when Jesus publicly accepts a proclamation of him being a Messiah. Bartimaeus says, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Okay. And it occurs right before Christ enters Jerusalem in triumph, as the crowds are shouting, "Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David." Now let's see if in this climactic and supremely important miracle in John's gospel and Mark's gospel, we have the themes that we've seen so far. So I ask you the question, is it a public miracle or a private miracle? Is there faith or not faith, and so forth? So Mark 10:46 and following. They came to Jericho, and as he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting beside the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he's calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Then Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. Okay. Is this a public or a private miracle?
Public.
Okay. Does Bartimaeus have faith or not?
Yeah.
How does he show his faith? Does the crowd try to shut him up?
He sprang up and came to Jesus.
Does he persevere then despite public censure and ridicule and pressure? That's how he showed his faith. Okay. The faith works the miracle. Note here, there is no problem working the miracle. We've had chapters of Jesus having difficulty working miracles because there wasn't enough faith. Now there's faith, and he does it immediately. He doesn't even say a healing word. Okay? But then, remember the strange conclusion. Jesus gives him permission to leave, but he doesn't. He follows Jesus on the way. The way to what? The way to Jerusalem, the way of the cross. All the passion predictions take place on the way. Okay? All right. So this story suggests that the faith which works miracles also leads people to follow Jesus when there is no miracle, when you're on the way to the cross. Okay? All right. Now, in line with the connection of miracles and the cross, Christ never uses miracles to evade suffering. We see this easily from the major sections in Mark in which miracles are prominent. In chapter 1, Jesus gets all kinds of approval from working miracles. Remember our good friend, the demon-possessed man, I know who you are, the Holy One of God. Jesus says, shut up and come out of him. And the word spreads throughout all of the surrounding region. Okay. He then ducks into Peter's house and in private works a miracle to heal Peter's mother-in-law. Then he works many miracles when people besiege him, but he will not let the demons speak because they know him, and then he quickly leaves town. He doesn't. The next day, the disciples say, everyone's looking for you. And Jesus says, let's go elsewhere. He's trying to avoid public acclaim, which will get in the way of the cross. By contrast, in chapter 2, instead of having miracle stories, we have disputes between Jesus and his critics. Incidentally, there's a nice transition for Mark. The transition point is a miracle story with a controversy in the middle of it. That's the man lowered through the roof. Remember what's in the middle. Jesus says, your sins are forgiven you, and his critics say only God can do that. Okay? So that here Mark combines a miracle story and a controversy story to make the transition from a long section on miracles to a long section on debates between Jesus and his critics. Mark likes to arrange stories by topic. Okay, a chapter on parables, for example. That's Mark's literary style. Put everything in one topic. Didn't your high school English teacher tell you this? Cover everything in one place. Anyway, Mark has learned that lesson. Okay. Note that in this controversy stories, we begin with the controversy of forgiving sins, and we end with a highly public miracle which leads the critics of Jesus to plot his death. Here's an illustration of a miracle which leads to a public miracle which leads to rejection. The Pharisees are around and they are wanting to see whether Jesus will work a miracle on the Sabbath so that they can accuse him. And then there's a man with a paralyzed hand, and Jesus says, get up and go to the center. Then he asks them, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath, or even to save a life? And they are silent. Jesus looks around with them in anger, and then he heals the man. Stretch out your hand, and he does stretch it out, and he's healed. And then the Pharisees take counsel with the Herodians how to kill Jesus. So here's another public miracle leading to rejection. Okay? So Jesus will never use miracles to escape the cross. Okay? Right. Now, if you're lost, we're on Roman numeral 13, capital letter C. I remember one of my students compared my lectures to what he called the shower method. Just drown students in data. So if you're lost, we're on 13C. Okay. Now, after 3:7, after the Pharisees and Herodians are plotting to kill Jesus, Jesus then works a series of miracles for his disciples in private. Here, the two ones I'm especially thinking of are the stilling of the storm, when the disciples are on a boat on the lake and are being swamped. Jesus stills the storm. And then the walking on water in chapter 6. Okay. Now, in both stories, there's this emphasis on perseverance. So the boat is being swamped, Jesus is asleep, the disciples wake him up, he stills the storm, but then says, why didn't you have any faith? In other words, you should have kept bailing out the boat. In the walking on water, we have an even wilder note. He sees them tormented in rowing, for the wind was against them, but he intended to pass them by. Sorry you're having trouble rowing. I'll see you on the other side. But they think he's a ghost and they cry out, so Jesus comes and solves the situation. Incidentally, both these miracles then are revelations of Christ's divinity. In the Hebrew Bible, it's God who controls the weather, who sends the rain and so forth. It's God who controls the waters, like dividing them at the Exodus, so the Israelites can walk through on dry land. Okay. And in the two greatest appearances of God in the Old Testament, in my opinion, it takes place while God is passing by. So in chapter, I can't remember the chapter, but in any case, in Exodus, Moses asks to see God, and God says, you can't see my face, otherwise I'd kill you. But I'll cover you with my hand, and I'll pass by, and you can see my backside. So to Elijah, when he goes to Mount Sinai in his own journey, he sees an earthquake and a fire and all this stuff as God passes by. Okay. All right, so these miracles show the divine power of Christ, but precisely because Christ has divine power, you should trust him and keep slogging along and not simply expect a miracle. Okay? Now, this all culminates on the cross. In the Passion, Christ's enemies challenge him to work a miracle to save himself and inspire faith. So here are the exact words. Let the Christ, Israel's King, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe. Okay? Jesus does not work the miracle. Why? For all the reasons we've seen. To comply would negate the cross. The faith this miracle would inspire is not what Mark means by faith. That is, faithfulness in the face of persistent suffering and obstacles. Moreover, Christ's suffering and death produce faith, because when Jesus dies with a loud cry, then the Roman soldier, presumably a pagan, says, truly this person was God's son. Okay. Moreover, Jesus is not the Messiah that his critics are looking for. Let Israel's King come down now from the cross and we will believe. That's not the kind of Messiah Jesus is, but that's next week's class. That is Mark's Christology understanding of Jesus. Okay. Clearly then, Mark's theology of miracles is a response to the false Christs and false prophets who are working signs and wonders to mislead, if possible, the chosen. You watch out. I've told you everything ahead of time. These figures are Christians. Mark says they come in Christ's name. Presumably they said, of course we're the new Jesus, because after all, Jesus worked miracles. We do too. Jesus saved his followers by stilling the storm. We'll save you if you acknowledge us as the Christ. Okay. In reply, Mark says this is not what Jesus was really about. He refused to work miracles to verify his own claims and gain his own glory. He called his followers to suffer and to endure. And real faith is that which causes you to persevere in the way of the cross when no miracle is given. Now back to the story with which I began about my friend Bud. Okay? Why did he become a Christian? after he ended up in this ridiculous situation where he was supervising seminarians because he was impressed by the love they had for each other. Why was he worried about the American miracle worker who put up signs all over the capital of Thailand, "Come and be healed"? Because Bud said, what would they think Christianity is really about? Okay, well, we've delayed long enough. It's time for your midterm. So for your midterm, we're going to have what one of my students asked for once, a socialist exam. That is, the whole class work together to try to figure that whether together they could pass. So I want to go back to our favorite miracle in Mark's gospel, the cursing of the fig tree. Okay? And I want to ask the question, in this infamous miracle, do we see some of the themes of Mark's gospel? Now remember the structure. Jesus goes to Jerusalem in triumph, but he doesn't do anything more. He returns to Bethany. Then the next morning, he sees a fig tree in leaf, and he goes up to it hoping to find something to eat. Then Mark helpfully says, it wasn't the season for figs. Then Jesus curses the tree, but apparently nothing happens. Then he has this great protest in the temple, disrupting activities. And the next morning, the disciples see that the fig tree has withered, and apparently they are surprised. And Jesus says, have faith in God. Truly, I tell you, if you say to this mountain, be taken up and be thrown in the sea, and do not doubt in your heart, it will be for you. Okay. Do you see in this very strange miracle the themes that we've been working off of both last time and this time?
So is the suffering his hunger?
No, I think that's just as a prop to get the miracle going. First of all, does this miracle appear to be an actual historical event, or does Mark give signs that it is a literary construction?
I don't think it makes any difference.
Well, whether it makes any difference is a different issue. But does Mark give a clear indication that Jesus had no right to think there'd be any figs?
Wasn't the season.
You know, it wasn't the season. And that's one of Mark's ways of saying, dear reader, this is a symbolic miracle. Okay? Certainly the owner of the fig tree would have been awfully angry, and rightfully so, if it had been a historical miracle. Now, does the miracle take place right away or not?
No.
Then is this a continuation of the theme of decreasing miracles?
Yes.
Quite possibly. Does Jesus then bring up the issue of lack of faith?
Trying to find it.
I'm going to say that it comes with the theme of reliance on God.
It does have that on it, of course, that's always there, but here's what Jesus says, okay? Then Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed has withered, as if he's surprised. Jesus answered them, have faith in God. Okay.
Yeah.
And then, okay. So this is the final miracle in the gospel, if you don't count the resurrection, which isn't narrated. In one sense, it is the worst of them all because it apparently takes a whole day for the tree to die, or at least it's not noticed for a whole day.
And what was
Mark brings up the issue of lack of faith. note that the miracle doesn't produce faith. He only urges them to have it.
Mm.
Okay. Of course, as we saw last time, it also points to the temple because Mark has interspersed the cursing the tree with the cleansing the temple. Just as the tree had leaves but no fruit, so the temple has magnificent buildings but no spiritual substance. Just as the tree does not die immediately, so the temple will not be destroyed at once. But the tree is cursed and will collapse, and Christ, in effect, curses the temple, and it will be destroyed. Now, this is an impressive illustration of Mark's literary technique, that he can use one story, the cursing of the fig tree, in two different ways. One, as a symbolic comment on the temple, but two, as really in many ways a summation of his most important themes about miracles. Okay. All right, then, I think I promised people half an hour of discussion and question time.
I'd just like to say one more thing about the fig tree.
Yes.
Because 2 chapters later, he brings up a fig tree again. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. When the leaves are tender, you know that summer is near. And this whole cursing the fig tree that doesn't produce is an ironic reassurance that though everything looks really awful, this isn't the season for what is really awful. So look beyond what you see.
Yeah, well, beyond is the destruction of the temple in another
Yes.
generation.
Yeah.
Thank you. I really hadn't thought about the statement about it from the fig tree, so I will put that into subsequent lectures. Thank you for noticing that. Thank you. Questions, comments, and short speeches.
Well, on the fig tree, what is going on within Jesus? There's a turmoil within him, an anger, a frustration, a recognition of and he's kind of
Well, what you're doing is a modern American analysis of the story. That is, we are perhaps more than any other generation in human history, we are individuals who are concerned with individual psychology. Okay, so you're asking the question, historically, what did Jesus feel at that time? Here it's important to note that the fig tree is a literary miracle, not a historical miracle. It wasn't the time for figs after all. Okay, and that to understand Mark's gospel, it's not helpful to ask modern questions. What you have to ask is, what is Mark doing in the narrative? And he's doing things like creating literary patterns and symbolism and so forth. And therefore, to ask, what did Jesus feel, is not in keeping with Mark's literary techniques, which would probably be generally true in the ancient world. It's modern individualism, which is so concerned about individual psychology.
But I take Al's question as being not about what he felt, in a human form, but rather what is the nature of God's response to the lack of faith, to the lack of, real commitment to God's way. And we see him first curse the tree for not doing what it should do, and then turning over the tables in the temple for not being, the right action there. So I think it's not a psychological question so much as it's a theological question. What's the nature of God's response to human disobedience?
But the tree was doing exactly what a fig tree should do at that time of year, because it wasn't the season.
Well, I have no trouble with the issue of what did Jesus feel like when he had his protest in the temple. I mean, that's clear enough, okay? And it was anger over the abuse of sacred things. Okay. It was also his public manifestation of his authority as the Messiah to set worship right. Note that in Mark's gospel, we read that shortly thereafter, the authorities confronted Jesus as to who gave you the authority to do this. Okay. So the issue is, what makes the temple really the house of God? And who has the authority to oversee the temple? Other questions or comments or issues?
Going back to the hemorrhaging woman,
Yes.
trembling, she violated every social norm
Yes.
of the time, and was taking basically a deep risk.
Yes.
And that was really that her faith was overcoming some major obstacles.
That's a good point.
Yeah. The one thing that got me with the feeding of the 5,000,
Yes.
that was also a breaking of the culture of things of that time, because when you shared food without washing, you were dealing with passing on something that could potentially be unclean to someone else. And his blessing over the loaves and fishes sort of was so inspiring to them that they, to me, they did something miraculous, that is living fully human, fully alive. And that broke down all the social barriers of the time, and being able to share with the others, not knowing if they were clean or not knowing what caste they were in and all that.
Yes, of course, this was typical of Jesus in general. Earlier in Mark's gospel, he's criticized for his disciples eating with defiled hands. And of course, he was notorious for eating with tax collectors and sinners. So it was a continuation of his mission, which is that the proclamation of the kingdom was for everyone, not just for those who were ritually clean.
Well, that to me is miracle making.
I really like the idea of faith as perseverance, and the illustration of the disciples in the boat fighting against the wind and the waves, and then the woman who, in spite of her trembling, comes forward.
Well, and Al points out the woman was extremely bold, since A, she was unclean, B, a woman touching a man who was not her husband was already extremely provocative in that culture.
Can I ask you about the admonition to keep it a secret? I'm still not quite sure I really understand what you're saying. Is it Mark saying that Jesus did not want certain things publicized because the people asking for it did not have true faith? Or
no, that's not the issue. Well, maybe it's the issue in a sense, but Mark is saying that Christianity is really not about becoming famous and acclaimed, and that in the early part of the gospel, the great temptation for Jesus is not to follow the way of the cross. And that's what Peter says, don't go in the way of the cross, be the great king. And therefore, when Jesus works miracles in Mark's gospel, which lead to public enthusiasm, he tries to keep them secret. But as we saw, he fails. Okay. But he will publicize miracles if they lead to rejection, as several of them do. So I think it's important to remember that we're not so much here reading on the level of the historical Jesus, although I do think Jesus in the beginning of his ministry tried to keep his messianic claims private to his disciples because he was intending to confront Jerusalem with his claims later. Okay. So I think initially he did keep his claims private, but here in this course, we're really asking, how does Mark retell the story of Jesus to address the problem of messianic miracle workers who are saying, I will protect you by working miracles if you revere me as the new Jesus?
And I would say that just because Mark was written at a time of great political unrest, that he might be making the point that getting somebody to protect me from suffering is actually co-opting me into the powers and principalities that Jesus is trying to lead me through. And that suffering is not a mark of my failure, nor is it a mark of my guilt. And that's part of the centurion sees Jesus as the Son of God at the end, that there was somebody who lived with perfect integrity. And purity, ritual purity, is a very different species of existence than personal integrity.
Yes, I agree.
The miracles are acts of compassion that would help me walk to the cross.
Yes, I agree.
That's yeah. That's a whole different dynamic than what I had previously thought. Thank you. Yeah, because it's got to inspire something in me beyond myself, beyond where I'm at right now, and to be more open to the kenosis of letting the divine become more part of me, and I become more part of the divine.
Yeah, and I think there's often, it's important to remember that miracles can draw attention to the miracle worker and enforce egoism and tyranny and all kinds of things. Okay. And mercifully, I don't have a television. This has made my life much better. But when I did have a television, it used to be that every once in a while, usually at 2 a.m. or something, they would have a show of some Christian working miracles in front of the camera. Have any of you seen these? I don't know if they're still around, but they were years ago. Anyone seen this?
Yes,
What, someone did? Yes?
yes.
Yeah, okay, so I have a witness. My question is, and then, please send in your check, okay? The question is, does this really illustrate Christianity, or is it more likely to feed the ego and the power and prestige of those who claim to work miracles? Certainly, the danger is there.
Mm.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about all of the, the real miracles that come into the world, or what I would consider real miracles. And they're not party tricks. They are experiences. A true miracle, I think, is an experience of God's work in the world, when it's unexpected, when it is, when it breaks into everything that we know as the way of the world, and somehow changes us, changes sort of it's a miracle is a moment when the divine breaks into the earthly existence, and that's not something that happens in front of a camera. It's not.
Yeah,
These
well,
are
I would agree that what you're describing is what's really important in religion and the way of faith. I don't want to get into a fight about what a word means in a dictionary. I mean, the word miracle is used in various ways. I personally prefer John's gospel to either Mark or Luke. Mark, miracles never help anyone's faith, and in Luke, miracles convert people in Luke Acts. I prefer John saying miracles of the healing variety, for example, are signs. They are real and they do help people, but they're really pointers to something else which is much more important, which for John includes, for example, the love of God as shown on the cross.
Mhm.
That's the fundamental issue. The healing of, say, the paralyzed man by the pool happens, but it's not the real issue. All right, then, one more
Sounds like
class to go. So we'll deal with Christology. Yes, I'm sorry.
Jim had a question.
oh, I was just saying, so it sounds like you're saying that the different gospel writers use the same miracles as different literary devices then.
To some extent, yes. But also, they have a different collection of miracles depending on who you're reading. But the theologies are different. So in Mark, we've talked about that. In Luke, we have all kinds of miracles, not just in Jesus, but Peter and Paul raised the dead and so forth, and they convert people. In John, which I prefer, the miracles do occur. They are signs of a larger reality. And I do think for many, many Christians, including myself, that when we're starting out in faith, often at least odd events occur, which seem to us not to be coincidence, and tend to say, there's something to this, something to faith. But that then, as you grow in faith, then those kinds of at least small miracles become far less important, and your faith is really supported by your growing relationship of God in love and your awareness that through the community, we are called to love others. But I do think, in many people's pilgrimage of faith, including my own, when you're starting out, the signs really are helpful. And I think they do occur. I do think the Holy Spirit does strange things. but that's not the substance of what Christianity is.
So we'll reconvene in a week, same
We'll
time, same place.
reconvene in a week, and that will be my swan song. So we'll
Living
have
in hope.
to all have a glass of wine virtually. We can all hold up our glasses and say, congratulations on finishing the course.
Thank you so much, Scott.
Thank you, Scott.
All
Good night.
right.
Thank you,
That is
Scott.
so.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank
See you next week.
See you next week.
Bye.
Till our
Bye.
paths cross again. Enjoy.
you.